Cool. No pressure. Thanks everyone for making, well, I guess you guys didn't really have a choice to attend the session, but I gave this presentation a couple months ago when we did the virtual customer marketing summit, and this is my second time doing a live event. I was at the BASE conference last week talking about events, and I think metrics is one of the most important topics that we as customer marketers need to be able to address and answer. I know you already heard from Dan, who kind of alluded to some of the things that the CMO is interested in, but metrics is one of the things that helped me in my career early on, being able to prove impact, being able to get increased headcount, resources, budget, et cetera. And so we're going to dive into the whole thing about metrics and hopefully make it a little bit easier for you guys. Let me see how to work this. So basically today's agenda, we're going to cover a couple different things. The first one is what to measure, and it begins by asking the right type of questions. It's also talking about aligning your priorities with leadership. It's also looking at the data, the MarTech, the integrations, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It's measuring your programs from A to Z. And then also I'm going to give you some North Star things that you guys can think about depending on the resources you have within your company, your organization, to actually build out dashboards and visualizations to take your reporting to the next level. So the first thing I want to kind of allude to is that this whole process with building metrics and reporting, it's all a journey. This is something that takes a lot of time. It takes thoughtful effort. I came from Marketo back in 2017, so I've been at Adobe now through the acquisition for about 5.5 years. And this is something that we've been working on for a number of years just to build the foundational elements. So I want you guys to think that this is not something you can just spin up overnight. It does take effort, but hopefully through this presentation you'll have some tangible takeaways on exactly how to do that. We talked about this, I think some other folks earlier today also mentioned it, but the one thing that I think customer marketing in general struggles with is being able to turn those fuzzy numbers into quantifiable ROI that essentially kind of rivals what our demand colleagues are doing, right? There's really no mistake why demand gen teams typically get 80-90% of the budget from CMOs. It's because they're able to prove pipeline impact. They're able to show specifically what's working in terms of generating leads and propelling the business forward. But I think this is hopefully going to help answer some of that too. I think some of the slides got a little bit messed up, but basically in most SaaS organizations, 75% of revenue comes from existing customers. I think this audience already kind of knows that, but I think it's worth repeating, especially with 25% of the business is so focused on inbound logo and acquisition. Jill Rell used to tell me, sales folks are always like drunk on inbound. And I think that's definitely true. Our CMO, our VP, they're still so focused on this, even though most of the revenue that we make at Adobe is from our recurring book of business. And so I really believe wholeheartedly, and I'm willing to die on the flag with this, but essentially customer retention is the most valuable thing that organizations could invest in. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically how to measure that holistically, but that's kind of the basic of it. So we're going to talk about sort of the 5 steps of how to approach this whole topic and this idea. The first one is being able to ask the right type of questions when you're thinking about measurement. Who are the people in the room that you need to bring together? It's also thinking about how do you create those shared goals with your leadership, your executive stakeholders. It's also being very clear with what you want to measure and being able to iterate as you go along the process as opposed to trying to do everything at once. It also means taking inventory of the types of programs that you're running and thinking about what are some things that you may have to consider sunsetting or refocusing your time and attention, especially if you have limited resources and budget. And then also just remember that you need to start small and then iterate as you go. So the first one is asking the right types of questions. And this begins with maybe getting your teams together. It could be having those conversations with your customer success leadership, your communications team, your marketing team, et cetera. And it's asking things like, what can you measure today? And what are you not measuring today that will likely have the greatest impact holistically for your business? And what are some things that require a little bit more time and attention from an integration standpoint? Where does the data live today? I think you can go on and on, but essentially it's asking these types of questions that helps you understand a little bit more about your business. Where are some of the gaps? Where are the potentials for opportunity? And then see where you want to go from there. Now, in terms of internal stakeholders, these are essentially kind of the 5 that we work very closely, but I think it's probably very similar to many companies that you guys work at as well, where you have these stakeholders across marketing, sales, customer success, product, and support. And each one of them have very distinct and unique priorities, but if you could essentially create shared goals across what you're doing in customer marketing, advocacy, and align that with these broader initiatives, that's going to help you get more visibility. It's going to help you create that center of excellence around all things of what you're doing. And so from a marketing standpoint, your CMO again is looking at things like pipeline influence. They're looking at brand awareness. They're also focused on retention, just as Dan alluded to. And from a sales standpoint, it's all about closing new deals. It's customer expansion, upsell, cross-sell. It's being able to tell more stories from a holistic view on what your customers are doing with their products and services. And then customer success is really about the value realization, right? It's time to value. How do you get your customers up to speed fast, quickly, so that they see success right out of the gate? And then it's a focus on that customer retention. From a product standpoint, again, it's value realization, it's customer feedback, it's business impact. And then from support, it's being able to resolve those tickets. Most of those support teams are usually billable. And so it's about case deflection. It's using the channels that you have, like community, et cetera, to help solve some of this. And again, it's value realization. So you can start to see that there's a lot of inherent synergies across these different teams. And I think it's just customer marketing is one great medium because you kind of sit at the middle of all this action. And you can start to bring the right people together to tell this story. And so what I'm going to tell you a little bit now is sort of like our North Stars, how our team is structured, and where we've gone through this evolution from being Marketo, a single solution company, to now supporting 8 to 9, 10 different solutions as part of Adobe Experience Cloud. So Adobe Customer Marketing for us, we call it ourselves retention marketing, but essentially it's the same thing. And our focus here is to being able to develop and execute programmatic nurtures aligned to the customer journey to drive adoption, create community, and essentially create advocates and customers for life. So I like to think of this as sort of like the 3-legged stool that has served us really well as we start to build the foundation of what is our story, how do we drive impact? And so the first piece is customer adoption. So that's all about value realization, like I said. It's about creating scalable nurtures that are specifically designed to help the customer see the impact of using your technology faster, right? The second thing is community, which is all about peer-to-peer networking. It's answering questions. We talked about case deflection, but really being able to drive that additional adoption within your online forums. And then the last one, which is advocacy, which essentially, how do you turn your customers into raving fans of your products and solutions? And so our North Stars of what we track and we try to measure, some of this stuff is still definitely much a work in progress, but we've essentially kind of built out a scoring model. So if you guys are familiar with how basic lead scoring works with demand gen, as someone moves down the pipeline and someone becomes a lead, ultimately becomes an opportunity, et cetera, we took that same methodology and we applied it to our scoring models across the board for these 3 metrics or these 3 areas. We're obviously biased because we use Marketo as our backbone. I'm going to spend the majority of this time talking specifically about the advocate score, but to talk a little bit high level in terms of adoption score metrics, it's looking at feature functionality, usage, to see if there's red flags, if a customer is going to churn, to be able to impact retention long term. It's not for save plays as opposed to planning out multiple quarters in the future on how you can make that impact so a customer wants to stay with you. There's the community engagement score, which I think this is probably actually one of the most challenging ones just because of all the different technologies that exist today for communities. But this is where you're taking your membership, you're taking your influence to adoption, loyalty, retention, you boil that all up to create a community engagement score. And then advocacy score, which again is looking at essentially your programs, specifically and how it impacts go-to-market and revenue across the board. So when I joined and over that evolution as we moved from Marketo to Adobe, we were running all these different programs you could see on the screen. It was a lot of different things. We had a team of about 6 or so individuals that were kind of running this holistically, everything from community to user groups to running our Influitive Purple Select community to references, et cetera. And it worked to some extent, but one of the major things that I had to do initially when I joined was how do you make sense of this, siloed ecosystem and make it very clear for the customer on specifically what are the opportunities, what does that journey look like if they're just getting started to the time that they have, that renewal conversation with their CSM, or they're looking to expand and grow. And so we essentially created this diagram back in 2018, and it's called the Advocate Nation. Some of you guys have seen this before, but this essentially became the cornerstone for our success in being able to create an internal resource that our sellers, our customer success teams understood as far as the value that our ecosystem has post-sale. But then it also became a great resource for our customers to understand, okay, I've been using Marketo for now 2 years. What does my journey look like? All of this is basically, assuming that there's sort of a linear journey, but that we all know that that's not necessarily the case with how your customers buy your products. But essentially, we had all the different components across these 7 different programs, and we let people know and almost gamified the process too, what specifically can they do as they get more acclimated and they want to become more involved in our ecosystem. And so as you can see at the very bottom here, we made it very clear that some of the incentives are you could earn swag, you could network with your peers, and we're going to specifically help you build your platform, your career, as you start to partner with us more closely. Now this diagram has evolved considerably over the past 2 or 3 years. What we have today is a little bit cleaner, more refined, I guess. Like our brand team is very particular in the coloring. We can't use anything purple anymore. But essentially the idea is very similar, right? It's to create a programmatic journey of where do you engage your customers from a scale standpoint, what are some of the high touch initiatives, and so these are essentially the 5 programs we run today. So the first one is Adobe User Groups. That's essentially in-person customer-led meetups that we run globally. The slide got a little bit cut off, but the second one is Community Advisors. That's essentially a top contributors program that drives deeper engagement, community vibrancy back to our online forums. Then we have our peer reviews, which I know a lot of you guys use them as well. So everything from Gartner Peer Insights, TrustRadius, and G2, those are the 3 primary ones. And using that as voice of the customer, product feedback, et cetera. Then we have our Adobe Champions program, which essentially is a program that's designed to drive really strong strategic relationships with 40 to 50 customers per solution that are expert practitioners that we essentially kind of treat as our brand ambassadors. And they're sort of an extension of our team. But then the last one is our Experience Maker Awards program, which we actually just wrapped up the virtual award celebration. We broadcasted it live on LinkedIn yesterday and this morning. And that's a celebration of recognizing customers across 16 different award categories. So I mention all this just to tell you what is the current landscape of what we work with today. And I'm going to be showing you specifically how do you tie this all together to show impact holistically. But I think for most customer marketing teams, you kind of struggle with kind of identifying holistically where do you start, right? You're getting asked a number of different things, everything from cross-sell, upsell, how do you drive attendance to your user groups, how do you drive membership to community, et cetera. And so you're pulled in a million different directions, and you're trying to make sense of all that chaos. And so I think what I'm going to show you specifically is how you can start to measure your programs individually, and then ultimately at a higher level. So to begin with, from an advocate growth standpoint, this is usually one of the easiest metrics to kind of measure because you're essentially just doing math and counting the number of advocates that you have within your ecosystem year over year. You could also look at that across each of your programs. Then you also have your community, which we talked about the community engagement score, but there's also like quarterly engagement. How is that spiking, increasing? How is that driving, community vibrancy? What does the month-over-month membership actually look like? How is it influencing support deflection? I think that's why the support teams love our community. And then from a reference standpoint, for those that are running them, it's time to value, it's being able to influence deal acceleration, pipeline, it's the number of references that you've maybe completed over a quarter. And then the last one is the average deal size. Now before, we used to have a threshold where we weren't going to be taking every single reference or call that came in because we didn't have enough team members to support it. And so we put in specific criteria where they had to be, maybe $250,000 a deal or larger to be able warranting our team's additional support to be able to fulfill that. From a user group standpoint, again, you can look at membership growth, chapter growth, you can look at it over time. ARR refers to annual recurring revenue of your overall membership. And then you have peer reviews. So this is something that we started doing where you take the actual contract value of your, let's say your TrustRadius account, you divide that by the number of reviews you've gathered in a given year, and that gives you a cost per review. So in this particular case, we took 75,000 and we got 500 reviews, and that's essentially $150 per review that you're generating. But you can start to see, you could decrease this number based on the number of review campaigns you run, the frequency with which you do these things. And then also there's the review piece, which can also help drive lead generation for your website across the board as you do it, as you use it for form fills. A couple other things you could look at for measurement. So if you're looking to measure your brand ambassador program, again, you could take the membership of your total audience base and track that back to your ARR. You could look at the engagement that those customers have towards influencing new business and retention opportunities. From customer stories, I think you look at everything from viewership, content syndication, downloads to those assets, how it's being leveraged by your sales teams, other folks internally, the cost per asset, the number of hours, or literally the finite amount of money that you're spending on it. Then you have your customer awards, where you're looking at year-over-year submission growth, you're looking at the finalists and winners ARR, pipeline to new advocates as you continue to build that up. Then you can also do direct mail for those that are using like Sendoso or Alice or another platform like that. Look at your cost per send. And then adoption metrics, it's looking at everything from protected revenue to how is your campaigns performing across in-product guidance, nurtures, events, et cetera. The last one I would say is like the holy grail for folks in customer marketing. It was for us, like the ability to be able to influence churn positively and directly correlate between customers that are advocates in particular accounts versus those that aren't have a higher likelihood to stay with you long term. This is something that took a lot of sleepless nights and effort to figure this out, but I'm essentially going to show exactly how you guys can do some of that. So these are just some things holistically individual that you can start to measure, but I'm also going to give you a little bit to let you understand some things are a little bit easier to measure than others, right? So I mentioned advocate growth and all these other things are easy, but then as you get into things that require MarTech integrations and data flows and stuff like that, that when it becomes a little bit more challenging, like literally the plumbing behind your MarTech stack. And then the things that are hard to measure, again, it's the program impact to churn. So I bring all this up because usually you're probably going to be asked by your CMO, your VP, to pull together all these stats, showcase that in a QBR of some kind. So hopefully the previous slides will give you some stuff that you can start to think about to arm yourself as you go into that QBR season each quarter at the back of, and keep it at the back of your mind. What I'm going to talk about now is essentially for those that want to continue to evolve this and build out, maybe a dashboard or a program or something like that to show your C-suite or executive staff how to essentially do that. Now, we work very hand in hand with these 4 teams. Essentially, it's marketing operations. They help us tell specifically what are the audiences, what's the results from the campaigns we're sending through email, other channels, et cetera. We work with sales operations, and hopefully you have a really good relationship with sales ops because they could tell you specifically tying back the win-loss reports specifically to your campaigns. Then you have your business and data analysts, and these are the folks that are holistically being able to tell and pull all the data together in one cohesive view so that you can make sense of all that data. And then finance, which usually has the most accurate information that they're sharing out with your C-suite, and then your executive folks as they kind of share that out to the street or other companies if you're doing any type of roll-up for public announcements and whatnot. This is just a quick meme because I like to include memes, but again, this is why you want to have a strong relationship with your sales ops, because if you don't, you're missing half of the puzzle of what you need. So building out the score. So I mentioned that Marketo is sort of the backbone of how we've all essentially accomplished this, but you could use any other marketing automation solution you want, maybe HubSpot, maybe Eloqua, et cetera. But what we've done is essentially taken each of these different MarTech solutions, touch points, everything from Khoros, Salesforce, RO Innovation, Bevy. Some of it doesn't exist necessarily on a specific platform, and so we have Advocate Smart Lists. And we pipe that all into Marketo, and then we push that out to Power BI. You could use Tableau, it doesn't really matter. But essentially, this is the simplified version of how we do it. And before I actually show you what the visuals look like, I do want to call out a couple pitfalls and challenges that you may encounter. The biggest one, I've been at every company I've ever worked out, there's always a challenge with dirty data, right? Whether it's your account team's not updating the records, your CSM is putting bogus information. I'm not trying to call anyone out, but stuff like that you deal with. Then you go through a process of data validation. How do you get rid of the duplications? How do you get with folks that left a company, making sure that that's all clean and hygienic? If you have multiple instances, I mean, we have 4 or 5 different Salesforce instances alone. That becomes its own challenge in itself. And then sometimes, and oftentimes this is the case, regardless if you're a startup or a large company, where does the data live? Sometimes you just don't really know, and there's really no clear owner. Sometimes it might sit within IT, it could sit within sales, et cetera. And then the integrations piece, which we just kind of talked about. So now I'm going to give you some real world examples of actual dashboards that we've started to build out. One thing I want to caveat is that this is all dummy data. My legal team, everyone else would kill me if I actually showed real data behind this. But essentially, this is one flavor of an executive dashboard you could build. As you see from the very top, the top line metric that I think your CMO, your VP of marketing cares about is what is your influence that advocacy is driving, could be customer marketing, to the bottom line to your business, right? Then you look at what is your overall ecosystem of unique accounts that you're engaging across your programs? What is that unique number of advocates? And then the penetration or accounts engaged is also a really interesting one because let's just use Marketo's example. Let's say there's 10,000 Marketo customers, 78%, then you're engaging about 7,800 customers. So you know specifically what's the greenfield look like for those customers that you have not engaged yet in your programs, and how can you create essentially like an ABM strategy around that. And each of these little headers that you see across the top, these are all clickable, so you can imagine you're able to look at a dashboard, you can click down even further, you can see specifically who are those customers, who are those accounts, and use that across your team to do a little bit more programmatic marketing. And then the churn piece, which I mentioned, that's looking at specifically how is that impacting churn positively. In this particular case, it is almost by a fourth or 25% or more. And then we also have the breakdown in terms of all the regions. So this is where we look at go-to-market segments. We also look at how can we work more closely with the regions to drive more energy and engagement, and also giving them a breakdown of the number of advocates that they should start to be working with for any type of campaign they're running, whether it's events or annual summit conference, et cetera. Another view they could look at, this is just another drill down for the churn analysis piece. So this again looks at just sort of like accounts that you've engaged across your programs, and then those that you have not. And again, these are the customers that you could then start to see programmatically. How could you work with your customer success team or your sales reps to specifically engage those customers and get them involved in your community or programs? Another slice you can look at is having a drill down by industry. And this is great because it tells you which are the industries that you're really strong in. If your team is structured in such a way where your customer stories are focused on specific industries or verticals, well then you know how you can start to handle that and where are the areas or gaps that you have potentially that you need to fix. And so everything from education and travel and hospitality is one example of an area that you could focus on, but this is kind of a cool way to do it. Another drill down in terms of distribution of programs. So this example specifically is using 4 programs, and it tells you of these 4, from user groups, our champions, our experience maker awards, and our community, where do we need to invest the most amount of money that's going to drive the greatest impact? And you could start to pull the lever. If you have a limited budget and you're noticing communities driving the most amount of users, well then maybe you could do some additional campaigns to influence that. I'm also going to give you a snapshot of an adoption dashboard. So again, adoption, we look at very different things, but essentially it's feature functionality usage. And this is across email campaigns, events. We do a lot of virtual events, webinars as well. And in-product guidance was something I didn't mention here. But similar kind of function, it looks at ARR influence to protected revenue that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And then you could break it down by segment, industry, all that kind of fun stuff. So that, to kind of sum up, is as you kind of roll out your first dashboard, this will probably be you because you're going to be celebrating at the bank. And again, I think with just kind of the way the business is running and the way the economy is kind of changing, customer retention is going to be a much more important and top of mind topic for your CMOs. And I think if you can get it in front of this right now, it's going to help you and pay dividends and help you get more budget and headcount as we start to move into the likelihood of a recession. So just in terms of closing remarks, I just want to mention again that you want to be very clear with the type of things that you are measuring. You want to partner with your internal stakeholders across the board. Understand that this is a journey. It's going to take time. All the stuff that I mentioned took numbers of years. And you want to align your programs with leadership priorities. So that's basically it. Here's my contact information, details. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well. One other thing I just want to mention is I am working with Customer Marketing Alliance to develop a certification program. Essentially, it's going to go deeper into the whole world of metrics, going through the A to Z of all things, how to build your programs at each stage of the funnel. This is supposed to launch, I believe, at the end of July. So I basically just have some screenshots at the moment, but I've spent probably 4 or 5 months kind of developing the content. It's over 300 slides of in-depth knowledge I learned from other folks as well as in my current role. So if anyone's interested, I could share more information when it does launch. And that's everything.
Kevin, I know why I heard air horns in my head when I hear of your name. It just multiple times there, just again and again. Really appreciate, the deep dive into how to have and design those meaningful metrics, and the dashboard visuals were awesome and felt very actionable for me. I'm sure other people maybe felt the same way. So we had a few questions roll in as you were speaking. One, you called out one pillar of impact that customer advocacy can play a role in as being product adoption. So would love to hear you expand a little bit more on that. How specifically can customer advocacy play a role in driving product adoption?
So I firmly believe that there's this synergistic relationship between, as customers become more mature, they eventually become advocates, right, long term. So it becomes this ongoing cycle. And what we've actually done for a lot of our nurtures and campaigns or in product guidance, what we do is we use actually our champions as example. These are folks that have been using our technology for 10 plus years. We actually infuse them directly in our messaging, our content. And so as opposed to customers learning directly from Adobe, they get to hear directly from another customer. And so it drives deeper engagement, product maturity. They'd rather hear from their peers anyways. And so we use that kind of hand in hand to drive product adoption. That's just one example. But we do it other ways, of course, through product feedback sessions, through surveys, through pretty much anything you can think of from that standpoint.
Awesome. And when you're discussing your measurements and building out those dashboards, what are some best practices to measure the ARR influence? In particular, this person's asking from a user group engagement.
Yeah, so does anyone use Bevy or has heard of Bevy? So Bevy is specifically a user group platform. And we started using this a couple years ago, but it has been one of the most beneficial resources to driving visibility, awareness for our user group program, but also the metrics behind it, because they have great dashboards and analytics on the back end. And we also use it to pipe it directly into Marketo. If you don't have Bevy, you of course can work off of just spreadsheets and tracking membership attendance over time. Again, it is going to be a little bit more granular, but you got to start somewhere, right? So you could go into your Salesforce instance, look up each customer account, look at the influence. work with your SOPs team to determine what is that influence number. And you could build out a scoring model by just being best friends with your marketing ops team. Like that's really foundationally where we started, and then we grew from there.
That's really interesting. As somebody who runs user groups, I will be looking into Bevy.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is around, you mentioned a revenue threshold required for your reference team to assist. Are you also tracking asks or references that don't meet that threshold to guard, over-tapping advocates?
Yeah, so our team's going to evolve where currently we don't do references anymore, but when we used to do it, we, of course, would get requests from sales teams and other folks would say, hey, even though it's not $250,000 as example, can you still help support us? What we try to do is recommend additional resources that have already been fleshed out. So whether you have your case studies, your customer quotes, driving them to your peer review sites, like I think that should be another way to help you scale as opposed to always having to be, be sort of like dictated to by your sales team, your account teams, right? To give you a little bit more control over the type of activities that you're willing to engage and support for your teams.
Yeah, thanks for breaking that down. And then this question, I hope I'm capturing it accurately, but when you're doing storytelling around the amount of revenue that advocacy influenced, do you use 100% of revenue, or do you use a multiplier when you're describing that end number to account for other influencers on the sale?
So we look, I guess it's a little bit complicated on the back end, but we look at some of the data and that's why I mentioned those 4 teams that we work hand in hand, because we can never really account for like 100% influence, right? Like there's other teams, I know we have some salespeople here, they would argue that sometimes marketing doesn't do anything, right? So you have to kind of factor in all those different pieces to show maybe the contribution is 10% of that deal size, or this customer story influenced X amount, right? So I think every company is going to be a little bit different how you calculate that.
Thank you. And the other question was around executive sponsors. How many do you have for this big, important initiative?
So we have our main executive sponsor, who's our VP of marketing. That's kind of the team that we sit within. There's also customer success. So essentially like those 5 teams or areas, those are all groups that we kind of work hand in hand with. But I would imagine like in other companies, you guys probably have a similar way that you have it structured.
Brilliant. And then this is our last question for you. So what is the role of Marketo marketing automation within advocacy?
Yeah, so Marketo, as I mentioned, it's like from the technology background, we feed everything into it. So that's like essentially the backbone of how we run our data. We streamline everything. It also helps us drive more scale. So we run email campaigns, nurtures, et cetera. One thing if you're looking to invest in for next year, definitely think about like your advocacy nurture strategy or customer marketing nurture strategy, because it's going to drive product adoption, it's going to drive advocates, pretty much the whole gamut. And so we use it pretty heavily for those areas too.
Wow, thank you so much. Took a lot of notes, really appreciate the whole talk. I wonder how many people feel like that directly answered some of their questions they've been spinning on. So thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing all of that. So we're going to take a break now, another coffee break, another bathroom break, get up and stretch. Yes, thank you, Kevin.